Hi, I'm Nicole Vogelsinger, and I'm so happy to have you with me today. We are going to be crafting with wood beads. Here is our class sample. You can see there is a row of houses that we're going to be making out of felt. We're going to be working with wood beads, lots of seed beads, lots of SuperDuos. It's going to be a whimsical little village, and we're going to craft it together. So let's get stitching. So let's start by going through the supplies that we're going to need. First, if you are working on a canvas, you're going to want a canvas. So I have two different sizes here. This is the 6x6. This is a 4x12. I found both of these at Michael's. My example was worked on a 4x12, and then during class today, I am going to show you the same sort of project, but on a 6x6. One thing to take note of, and I'm going to show you the back of this right now, there is not a lot of room to work with this, and I'm going to show you ways to work around that. I am putting up with this because I really wanted this shape for my houses. So if you're not tied to a shape like that and it doesn't matter to you if it's a long and skinny one or if it's one that's more like this, pay attention to the back of the hoop as you're looking for it. This one, I have a little bit more room here, but there are some hoops that have a much bigger area on the back to work with. Just something to keep in mind as you look for a canvas for your project. If you're not using canvas, you're just going to want an embroidery hoop. And then next, you're going to want fabric. So I have this piece of fabric. It's very well loved. I've used it for a lot of projects. This is just a fat quarter. Actually, I think this might have been a half yard cut. When you are looking at your fabric, you just want to make sure that you have enough that you're going to be able to get it to go all the way around the back of the hoop. Not all the way around, but you want it, we're going to be stapling this in, and so you want enough fabric to be able to cover the back. And I think I am just going to be able to make it with this piece of fabric. For our little houses, I have felt. So this is Woolworks. It's a pre-felted 100% wool. It's from Andover. You can use, if you have like a wool felt, that works great. If you have just a craft felt, that also works very well for this project. This is what you are going to cut your houses out of. So again, you don't need a ton. We're just going to be making little cuts. So just a few pieces in your chosen colors. Let's talk thread. So the threads aren't quite as important in this project because the only thread that's super visible is the thread for our little wooden bead houses. For that, I am using a needlepoint yarn. A thicker yarn or thread definitely works better for this project. You're going to get more coverage on the beads, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So just a needlepoint yarn. If you have a sock weight yarn, that could work great too. Again, you don't need tons of it. This is actually one full skein of well, it's a mini skein of yarn that I have that I just love the colors, and it works perfectly. And then for other threads, I'm going to be using some of my favorite. These are my Sue Spargo Wonderful Eleganza threads. These are pearl cottons, just in a few colors that I wanted to use for this color palette. And then also this is a 12 weight cotton thread. So this is going to be what I'm using for my beads and other embellishments, the sequins, everything. So just a 12 weight, a nice beading thread. Back to the wool, I am using, these are pre-cut circles. These are wool circles. These are also from Wonderful Specialty Threads, and I love these because they're already cut in a bunch of different colors. Now, you don't have to have this. If you have felt for your houses, you're going to have extra bits of felt. And what I'm using these for are just little accents on the houses. So you can see you don't need a ton. It's just nice to have a few colors of felt. And these can be the same colors that you're using for the felt for your houses. So you don't have to go out and buy tons of felt. You're just going to need little bits of felt. and let's talk beads. So this is my main bead strand. I already cut some of those off. So this is a John bead. These are wooden beads, and this is normally a double strand, but I already used part of the strand for my houses. So you can see there's ovals and there's little squares. I'm going to be using the little squares from this strand of beads. I'm going to want a few larger beads. These are some accent beads. So these are the SuperDuo beads. They are going to be an accent bead that we're using for our houses. So these are the oval shaped beads with the two little holes, and we're going to work through different ways of adding them to our houses. Also, bugle beads. I love a good bugle bead. I have some of the Miyuki bugles and just some of the check glass bugles. I'm also using some size 6 check seed beads. And then I have, these are just a shaped bead, any sort of accent bead that you want to use. I like to just have a variety of beads to play with when I am stitching a project. Another fun accessory, if you are a crafter, you probably have lots of buttons laying around. These are just 2 of my button jars. I love buttons. I've loved them since I was little, and I love adding them into projects. And so I'm going to pull a few buttons as needed. This is an optional part of the project, but I do think it adds to the charm of the houses. So let's talk notions then. I, of course, always have my bead trays. This stuff is amazing. I can't recommend it enough, and I used it for this project a ton. This is the Roxanne Glue Base Kit. I will show you how easy and how helpful it is to use this for this house project. If you don't have this and you don't want to rush out and get it, just a glue stick will work good, or just a white school glue. But I definitely recommend this and love working with it. You are going to want something to mark your felt with. I'm just using this Clover water-soluble pencil in white because it's going to show up for all of my different felts. Now, a pair of tweezers is not necessary, but it is helpful, and I will show you why this is helpful as we get to stitching our project. You're also going to want a variety of needles. This is a doll needle. It is not necessary, but it is an option, and I'm going to show you why it's so helpful in stitching a canvas. If you don't have it, don't worry about it. And then just you're going to want a variety of needles. If you're working with the Miyuki bugle beads, you're going to want a thin needle to be able to go through those thin beads. So just a variety of needles to work with. If you are working with a canvas, you're also going to want a staple gun. This is my handy dandy and very well used, just Stanley heavy duty staple gun. So let's get started by preparing our canvas. If you are not using a canvas, all you're going to want is your fabric and your embroidery hoop, and you're going to place your fabric in the embroidery hoop, cut out the fabric or cut out the embroidery hoop, and you're going to leave about 2 inches all the way around. If you're using a canvas, this is how we are going to prepare it. So I'm going to just trim some excess fabric. I'm not going to need all of this, and it is easier to not have all of that extra laying around. And then I'm just going to kind of center this around here. So this fabric, you'll see from the front, has some lines on it. It also has some creases. I am not super worried about those because we're going to be stretching this over the canvas, and these are going to get stretched out. But you also can iron your fabric totally fine. I'm just always up for taking shortcuts whenever possible. All right, so I like to work this one side at a time. And I am just going to start by pulling, but not too tight, pulling on my canvas, on my fabric, and just folding it over the canvas like this. You can see I have some extra here. When I'm completely done, I will trim that away. Right now, I'm going to leave it this way. And what I was saying is I do have lines in this fabric, So I'm just gonna, as I'm stapling this, be aware that I'm not stretching it too tight because I don't want the lines to get misshapen on the front. All right, so cover your ears. We're gonna staple this. Just one little staple on each corner for now. That wasn't too bad. Here we go. So there's our first one, and now we're gonna do the opposite side, the same exact thing. And you're gonna just pull it tightly, fold it over, and then I like to check the front. So I think I can definitely pull it a little bit tighter. You can see it's starting to pull those wrinkles out, but it's also not getting too misshapen. So I'm gonna be okay pulling this tighter. Once it's pulled nice and tight, and you can feel it. You can feel when you're stapling this, the fabric is definitely like it can't go anymore. And that's when you know you're okay to staple. One note about stapling, I'm working at my desk, which has several protective mats on the desk, so I'm not worried about damaging anything. It's just a stapler, but it is a heavy-duty stapler, so work on a surface that you feel is nice and sturdy and not like your beautiful pristine wood table or anything. Okay, so now I have this stapled on here. I am going to work on the other ends, and I'm going to fold this in just like that on each side. So that's, I like to practice how I'm folding it first, and my goal is that I want to have a nice smooth edge right here. You can see it's just folding it, this is like wrapping paper, so it's like you're wrapping a present. And sometimes you do need to practice a little bit with your folds and play around with it so that they get nice and neat. You want to be happy with this part of it. See, like I have a little wrinkle there. So I'm just going to keep working at this until I know, there we go. That's a nice smooth edge. I'm going to staple that here. And I'm doing the same thing over here. And do the same thing over here. This fabric, by the way, is from the Chalk and Chalk, that's a mouthful, a Chalk and Charcoal line by Jennifer Sampu. I love this fabric. I have it in a ton of colors. It's a great basic fabric for a project like this, where you want a solid, but you're okay with a little bit of pattern as well. So here I'm going to fold both ends first. It is a little easier actually to do both ends. You just have to make sure you're folding and holding. So if you have to put something on that little fold to hold it, you can do that. This part might take you a little bit just because I really like to make sure that my corners are nice and smooth. And you're working with fabric, so be patient and just get it perfect. Okay, so you have 4 corners stapled down. You're not quite done yet. We're still going to do one final stretching of the fabric. I like to check the front. The front is looking great, but you can see I still have some fabric along here. So I am going to do exactly the same thing. I'm just pulling my fabric. You can trim it first if you want, or you can trim it at the very end. but I'm giving it one final pull, and I'm gonna do another staple or two in each of these sections. You want it to be nice and tight. You don't want this rippling at all while you're stitching. That looks great. I am really happy with this. I'm gonna leave this little bit on here. I'm all about the selvages, and I love the selvages of fabric, so I'm gonna leave that. I'm actually not gonna trim that part, but I am gonna trim just this little bit here because it's a little bit extra. I don't need it. And I'm gonna do the same thing over here. Remember, this is the hoop guts of your project. My hoop guts are never perfect, and I always like to see what decisions I made on the back of the hoop or the back of the canvas. So be happy with this, and if you feel like you need another staple or two, you can absolutely do that so that your canvas feels really good and the fabric feels tight from the front. So we have our canvas prepared, and the next step is to get our felt houses cut out. For this, we are going to want our strand of beads, if you're using those. We're going to pull off the square ones for the houses. I like to use these as a reference for the size of the houses. So on this canvas, I created the houses to just be one level little houses. You can see they all are in the same scale as the bead, and they fit well on this canvas. For this canvas, I think we're going to do a slight modification. If we did little tiny houses that went across here, there'd be so much open space up here, and it wouldn't look right. Like, we need a little bit more. So I think we are going to do double the size of houses. And for that, I'm going to be doubling this bead up. We're just going to see how this goes. We'll probably put a little one in there, and we're going to put some other shaped houses in there too. So this part of the project is free-handed. I'm going to show you how I create the houses. So there is not a pattern for the houses, you'll notice. That's because we all know what houses look like, and this is something that is meant to freehand. Everybody's is going to look different. So all you need is, I'm going to use a ruler. You don't have to. I have my water-soluble pencil. Use what you have and are comfortable using. I have these two wooden beads here just for size reference. I know that I'm going to want my houses to be about this size, and I actually might make a few a little bit taller. I have one spare bead, so I might make another one in between that size. So we're just going to go with this and see what we like. I'm actually going to put I'm going to do it this way. And if you don't feel like using this and cutting it out and everything, just cut out the shape of your house and go with it that way. I'm just going to keep these two down here. I'm going to try and keep them even. All right, so I've got my straight edge, and I'm just running my pencil along the felt. It doesn't have to be a super noticeable line, just enough that I can see where my mark is and I can cut it. So once you have your house shape, you can cut it out. And if you wanted to use fabric for this instead of felt, you absolutely could do that. This is your own project, so you can play with the fabrics as much as you want to. Play with the different textures and the size of the canvas, and let's see. So this is what we have, and I like to just lay it all out, see what I'm working with on this piece. I really like this sized house, and I'm feeling the back of my project because remember, I have quite a bit of wooden frame here. And so I'm going to be lining up my houses with the bottom of that frame to make it easier to stitch. So we are just going to keep going with that. Now that I have this shape, I might use this one to create my next house. And I'm going to make this one a little skinnier. And actually I wanted to make that one a little taller. So you can see that this part of the project, it's very personal and unique to you. Have fun cutting out the shapes of your houses. Once you have your house shapes cut out, you can go back and create the roof. So the way I create the roof is I just put my little house shape here. I actually should use a different color pencil, and you just draw your little roof on the same freehanding that we've done with all of these houses. And when you get to creating the roof for your bead, you're going to do the same exact thing. Just trace out your little shape for your roof. I like to lay the bead there to just gauge the size. I love a project like this where it just begins with lots of simple shapes. Whenever I don't have to use a pattern for something, that is my favorite sort of project because I am not a pattern lover. I love to be able to just kind of freehand things, and houses are so much fun to freehand. So there's my little row of houses. None of these are attached yet. I was just laying them out to gauge the size. So the next step is actually attaching the houses to the fabric. And this is a step that you're going to want to take, but then give yourself a little time for the glue to dry. So this is where I'm using my Roxanne glue based it. And again, if you have a glue stick, perfectly fine. If you're just using like a white school glue, also perfectly fine. I love this because it has a little brush on the end, just like a makeup brush, and I can just dab the glue wherever I want it to attach. And you can see I'm laying it down on the fabric. It's not even collecting the fibers from the felt, which is really nice. And you don't need a ton of glue. You just need enough that it's going to hold this in place. We're going to be embroidering over it. So you don't want tons and tons of glue. You don't want it to be like soggy with glue. You just want it to have enough. And then you're going to place it where you want your little house to be. I'm going to just tap it down. That will dry as I continue with the rest of these. And then I'm going to set it aside and stitch it when it's completely dry. Now I am not doing that with my wooden beads. I am leaving these off. I'm actually not even going to attach the roof of these beads yet because we are going to stitch them on. So I'm only attaching all of the other felt houses. Okay, so those are all drying, and we're going to take that little roof off, and we're going to take one of the little beads away, and I am going to get my thread. So this is a strand of needlepoint yarn from Koigu, and I love the variegated color. I think the variegation is so pretty, and I love how it turns out when you stitch with it. So I'm just going to thread a needle. I'm using a milliner's needle. Whatever needle you use, you just want to make sure that you can thread your yarn or thicker thread through it. So this is a milliner's needle. It has a slightly larger eye, and it's also a longer needle, which will help in a canvas project like this. So our first step is placing the wooden bead. I've got a little thread here. Placing the wooden bead where we want it on the fabric. And you're just going to be holding it on for these first few stitches. So I'm just now going to anchor it on here. I'm bringing my needle through the back of the canvas to the front. And now I'm just going to anchor this bead down. So I'm just stitching over it. I have a long length of thread for this first part. Normally I do not use thread with this amount of thread excess as I'm stitching, but for a project like this, I am using a lot of thread because once I'm stitching, I just kind of want to keep going with it. I don't want to have to keep stopping and starting. I got a little tangle back there. So I'm just going all the way around on each of the sides to anchor this in place. I am only working on one of the beads right now. You know that I have two that I'm going to be stacking on here for the houses. I only want my one bead on here right now. We're going to take it one at a time. And so if you're doing just a single bead for the houses, like in my first example, that's all you need to worry about right now. Okay, so my bead is in place. There's still a little bit of movement, but it's not going anywhere, and I'm going to be stitching this down even more now. So just pick an area that you want to start with close to one of your anchor stitches. And I am bringing my needle up through the center, and I'm going down on the outside. And each stitch that I make is going to be super close to the previous stitch because remember, we are filling up this whole wooden bead with stitches. And so you want them to be tightly packed so that when you look at your little house, you don't see any of the wood showing through. Actually, you see a tiny bit of wood showing through. Corners are the trickiest part, and we will get to that. But you want these stitches to be really close together as you are stitching them. So as I'm taking my needle up through the middle of this bead, I'm just bringing it super, super close to my previous stitch. If I need to kind of layer a stitch on top or go back to fill in a little space that I might have missed, like if there's a little gap, you can do that too. As I am stitching one section of the bead, so this is a section of the bead, I'm thinking about the corner. So we have a square bead with a corner, the circle in the middle. It can be a little tricky. I'm not going to lie. It can be a little tricky to completely cover up the corner, and you might need a little extra thread to go around that shape. And so as I am stitching it, I'm thinking ahead about how my stitches are going to lay. This is sometimes why it's not a good idea to use so much thread, because you can see it doesn't want to cooperate with me. So I'm thinking ahead to where my needle is going to be coming up, where my threads are going to be placed on the bead. I'm starting to overlap in little spots. Like as I'm coming up from the center, I might be overlapping on a previous, like where I previously came up. So like I'm going to do right here. I'm just kind of overlapping there because this is such a small space that we're working with and we're covering a larger area. So that will make sense as you're working with it, that you're going to want to overlap some of your stitches as you start to go around that circle to cover up the corner. This is also why a thicker thread really works nicely, because with a thin thread, it would take forever to fill up this area, and a thin thread would just let too much of the bead show through. So this is something that really is best to just work at. Sometimes you need to just have the needle and thread in your hand and work your way around the bead to see how best to cover your area. So just take your time. Slow stitching is a thing. It's because it's slow, and that's totally fine. You're working with a canvas and fabric and thicker threads, so just be patient. This does take a fair amount of time to stitch up these beads. The effect is going to be awesome though, so keep at it. As you are working your corner, you can see I came up, I gave myself another little section that I'm filling in, and now I'm going to be working from the outside in to help me control the threads a little bit more. So I'm working from the outer edge of this bead, and I'm working towards the inner circle. Still trying to keep my threads untangled. You'll also notice that your tension becomes important here. So as I am bringing my stitches and covering up this square shape, if I am able to not pull my thread quite as tight, I'm going to get better coverage. So as I am, this is one area that just wants to tangle. As I'm bringing it up, I'm not really yanking on the thread. I want to keep it kind of loose, and your threads are going to lay nicer, and there isn't going to be as much gapping with the thread and the bead if you're able to keep the tension kind of loose. You don't want threads flapping around, but you don't want to pull too tight either, because that just flattens the yarn or the thread that you're using too much. So I'm just going to keep working at this, covering up my bead on all the corners. These corners are the trickiest part. Once you get that, you will be fine, and you can keep stitching these beads. So here's what it looks like all stitched up. You can see that I covered all the areas. There's one tiny little bit there, but when you just move the thread. So here it is, all stitched up. Now I'm going to add another one on top of this. If you're doing the same thing, the one thing to keep in mind is that you want to leave just a tiny bit of extra space in between the two, because if you're using a thicker yarn, you need space for that yarn. So just estimate about how far apart these need to be, and then you could do the same exact thing to stitch this bead onto here. So here is my finished little bead house, which I think looks adorable, especially with this. I absolutely love this variegated yarn. So I am going to put my other little roof on there. I wasn't sure how this one was going to turn out, because with my other example, I just used one bead for each house. So that is your clue to, or your permission to experiment with stuff. Even if you're not exactly sure how it's going to turn out, I'm super happy with this. It's adorable. I think this is just as adorable, and I had fun doing each of these, like designing the houses for each of these. So have fun. If you're using a larger canvas and you have more square beads, have fun with the shape and the placement of them and the threads that you use. So get to this point, and the next step is going to be, I think we're going to start with embroidering our roofs for the houses. So now I am moving into embroidering the roofs with the SuperDuo beads. So these are the 3 colors that I have. And I love SuperDuos because there's a lot of variety in how you can stitch them onto your piece. So I'm going to show you a few of the methods. And you might even come up with some of your own different ways to stitch them on. So you are going to want a length of thread, and I'm just using like about a 12-inch length of thread. I tie a knot at the end, and then for a needle, you just want to make sure that your needle, before you go to the effort of threading it, make sure that a SuperDuo bead can pass over the needle. You just want to make sure that it's not going to get stuck once you've threaded it and you're all ready to start embroidering. Just always double check, because these are tinier holes and sometimes you need a thinner needle. So thread your needle and gather your beads and pick a roof that you want to start on. I am just going to start probably on the roof with the 2 wooden beads. So I'm going to bring my needle up, and you do want to make sure your roofs are all dry. If you've used the glue based it, you'll notice that your roofs are definitely like adhered to the fabric, but the little edges might lift up a bit as you bring your needle through it, and that's completely fine. The stitching that we are going to be adding to this piece is going to secure the roofs onto the fabric. So I've brought my needle and thread through the roof, and I'm just putting a bead on the needle. And then once it's down, I'm going to just position it before I take my needle through the hole again, or through the second hole. So you can see right there. And we are just going to flatly stitch these to the fabric. I'm using a 12-weight thread. It's a thread that you can see a contrasting color, because I just think that looks really pretty with a project like this. And I'm just going to scatter a few of these on the roof. I'm not lining them up. I'm just adding them where I feel like they would look good. So just adding a bead and then positioning it with my needle and then taking the needle down again. This is probably the simplest way to use a SuperDuo bead. Very straightforward and easy to, you can play with the colors of the beads, mix and match them. I'm going to use all one color for this roof. They're just cute and sprinkled around, and it really adds to the whimsy of this design. And I think I'm probably going to add one more. I really like working in odd numbers with beads, and I think one more will just about fit this perfectly. I think I'm going to use the off-white beads, on this roof only, to kind of make this house stand out. This house already stands out because it's stitched in a different way with the wood beads. So I'm just going to let it stand out even more with the roof like that. So I'm going to put those aside and move on to the next color. Now in this example, I'm going to hold it to the side. You can see that I stitched through only one hole of the bead, and the beads are all kind of movable still, but they're stitched very closely together. So it's kind of like a cluster of beads. So let's do that on the next roof. So I'm just leaving my needle threaded the way it was because I have enough thread. Because these roofs are tiny, You don't need lots of beads to fill up a space, which is kind of nice. So I'm going to stitch these on one by one, and I'm putting the bead on, and I'm just coming back down into the same hole again that I brought my needle out of. And if it's not exactly the same hole, but it's like right next to it, that's good. And then I'm just going to bring my needle up. And I'm stitching these kind of close to each other. You can see in this example, I kind of have them staggered. Or actually the way they fall makes it look as if they're staggered. So again, just taking my needle and thread through the bead and then taking it back down. I just kind of push the bead out of the way, and I take my needle back down into the same hole. So I think I'm going to be able to fit maybe 4 on this roof. So there is my first row of beads. Now, as I do my second and third and maybe possibly fourth, depending on how many rows it will allow me to do here, I'm just going to stagger where I put the beads so that they have a nice like clustered effect, just like in the example I showed you. So I'm just coming up a little bit and bringing my needle and thread, like the bead is going to fall kind of in between these 2 beads in the next row. So I'm just going to keep doing this same thing with each bead, just going through one hole and staggering where I place them as I stitch down this roof. So here are my staggered beads, which look really cute. From the side, you get a lot of dimension this way. Now I am almost at the end of my thread. So when I come to this point, because I have beads that I'm working with, I want to tie a knot in my embroidery. So what I do is I just take my needle through, I'm just kind of going under a few of these stitches. Just a few times, and then I'll tie a little knot. I always tie knots on my threads after I'm done stitching with beads. If I'm wearing it, washing it, or using beads, always tie a knot. If you're just using threads and there aren't any beads, you can just run your needle under a few stitches and trim it, and you'll be fine. In this roof, you can see, I'm going to hold it from the side. You can see that, or actually I'll show you closer this way. You can see that there are 2 threads running through this row of beads. There's still a little bit of movement there, and I'll show you how we can do this. So choose one of your roofs and bring your needle and thread up through the roof. I'm going to pick a different color this time, and I'm going to put a few beads on my needle. I think we're going to start with 5 and see how that looks, just to gauge the size of it, and if I have the right amount of beads. You can just hold your needle against the roof, and that's going to work perfectly. So I'm just taking my needle, or I'm taking my beads all the way through, And I've only gone through the one hole at this point. And so now I'm going to take my needle and thread through the roof. You can see that these aren't completely straight, which is okay. We're going to take another pass through the bottom hole now. So I'm bringing my needle up again, gauging about where the second hole of the bead is. And now I'm going to take that through each of the bottom holes of these beads. This second strand is what's going to anchor the beads more. And there is a nice curve to it. The way you get that curve is when you're stringing your beads and taking your needle down. I'm not extending the thread and needle as far as it can go. I'm kind of letting it go in a little bit so that there's a little bit of looseness to the threads, and that's how you're going to get like a nice little curve. So you can see it's almost like a little raised bridge when you look at it from the side. And here you've got a pretty little curve. I really like that effect with the SuperDuos. So we're going to do that one more time. And you can see these are all just very easy methods to just attach them so that each one looks a little bit different, but you're using the same bead shape, which is kind of fun to play around with it and see what options you can get. So this one we might actually just need 3 beads. Yeah. So then again, I'm taking my needle. What I mean by extending it, I'm not bringing my needle down as far as these beads will extend. I'm kind of coming in a little bit so that they're a little bit more raised off of the fabric that way. And then I'm going to bring my needle up on the other side and go through the bottom holes. And then I'm taking it down again. I like seeing the thread showing through too. I really like using a different color thread so that the thread is kind of noticeable when you're doing this. And I think I'm just going to add one more up top. Using one bead, my method is exactly the same for this one, so that it's on its side rather than flat like this. So there is my other roof. So you can see there's 3 different methods for attaching these. You could continue doing something like this where we just attached one through the bottom hole, but you could just scatter them throughout the roof like that. You could do this method where we stitched them flat, and you could have them going up and down on the roof instead, and you can just scatter too. It doesn't need to fill up the roof completely. So now I am pulling out the Sequins and Beads kits. I love these because there are 3 different sequin sizes included in this, and I love color coordinating my sequins. So on this roof, you can see I stacked different sized sequins. That is a great way to add a lot of color to your project. This is the roof, and this is the roof where I'm adding the sequins. When we look at the back, you can see that this and this are the 2 wooden parts of the frame, and those are where my houses are. So if you are working on a canvas and not an embroidery hoop, this is where it gets a tiny bit tricky and where you might need to use a longer needle. I'm not using the doll needle at this point. The doll needle is a long needle and helps you when you're stitching with just embroidery floss or a thread to be able to reach these tougher areas. You can see that I can easily take my needle through the back at an angle and go through this roof. So this is the needle that I'm going to be using when I'm working on this house and when I'm working on this house. It just helps you get to the very edge of the canvas. The canvas is not completely flat against the wood frame, so there is a little bit of give. You can see that as I press on it, you can see underneath the wood. So you're able to angle a needle through that area. So once my needle is up, I am going to take a large sequin. This is the largest of the yellow sequins. And you can see it adds a lot of shine right away. Now I'm going to stack another green one on there. Just like that. And I might see if one of these tiny yellow sequins will fit through this needle. It does, just barely, but it fits. So there's my little stack of 3 sequins. I love doing a sequin stack because you can get different colors in here and it really hits the light differently. And all I'm going to do at this point is take my needle down. I'm angling it so that I can get past the wood part of the frame. And I'm just taking it through the fabric, just like that. This time, I'm just going to be scattering sequins with 1 on each one. And I'm probably going to use 2 different sizes of the yellow and the green. This is super easy, basically the same exact thing, except you're not stacking your sequins and you're only securing them at the top. Another way you could do this is once I secure it at the top, I could also bring another stitch through and secure it at the bottom. And then there is less movement and you can be more precise with how they line up. But precise is not what I'm looking for with this project. I like the, again, whimsical look of these houses. And so I want my sequins to kind of scatter throughout it on the roof. So there are my sequined houses. I think it looks really cute. And now we're ready to add some more embellishments and stitching to our house bodies. So now I'm going to be working with the wool circles. And again, if you don't have the cut wool circles like I'm using and you want to just use felt pieces that you cut out yourself, have fun with that. You can even do a shape other than a circle. I am going to do half circles and I'm going to cut my little circle and I'm going to be placing these as little dimensional pieces along my house. Some of these are going to get beaded, some will just be, I've beaded some of these, some I've just done stitching, probably the end ones, because again, we are working with the framed area, so it's easier just to do thread. But you can see there's a variety of things that you can do with these. You can also layer them, which is kind of a fun look, and I might do for a few of these. So I'm just going to play with the placement of some of these, and that's all you can do. You're just seeing what you like the look of. I have different sizes. I'm trying to bring in the colors from this thread so that it doesn't feel like this is the only house that really stands out. I want some of these pinks throughout here. Quickly added a lot of color and shape to this, and I love working with the simple shapes and seeing how I can embellish it with embroidery to make it look really cool. So this is a great embellishment to have on hand to add to your embroidery, and it's just as simple as dabbing it with a little glue and letting it dry. So now I'm moving on to some size 8 seed beads, and I'm bringing in a few brighter colors. Again, I'm thinking of this color yarn that I used to embellish, and I have a few brighter pops of color in there. So spreading that color out throughout the project is just going to make everything feel more cohesive. And that's the goal. As I'm embroidering, I'm thinking about what am I doing and how is it all blending together. I did mention this one roof I wanted to stand out. I'm still really liking that choice and that decision, but now I want everything to start feeling more together. And so that's where the beads and the thread are going to come into play. So I am picking a size 5. This is an eleganza pearl cotton. So a pearl cotton means that you can just, it's a thread that's not divisible. So I can cut it right off of the spool and start stitching with it, rather than a thread that is stranded and you have to divide into sections of thread. I'm actually coming up outside of the house, so it's right alongside the house. And I'm bringing my needle and thread up. So I'm adding a bead, and now I'm just going to bring my needle and thread down on the outside of the circle. There's so much variety in how you can stitch this, but for this example, I want my bead to stay right along the edge of the half circle. So now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm bringing my needle up again, right about in the same area. And I'm just going to go out in little rays and do the same thing here. Take it down right outside of the circle. So this thread has the dual purpose of holding this in place, even though, yes, I already glued it, but it really secures it into place. And it's also adding some color, and you can see what a difference it already makes when it's compared with another one. So that is how I added all of the beads along here. Now you also, so this is what we just did, but you also can bring the bead closer to the inside, and then it stays right on the felt piece rather than extending beyond the felt piece. And I'll show you that now. It's the same exact method. It's just placing the bead and the needle in a slightly different spot. So let's pick this nice teal color. And I'm going to come down onto the felt piece this time. So see, it's just the different placement of your needle and thread puts the bead in a different area. Super simple. And you can experiment with what you like as you add your beads to your embellishments. One little tip that I also said I would mention about using tweezers and working with this, if you get to a point in working with your canvas where the needle, you can't exactly pull it out because it's too close to the wood, the tweezers really come in handy. And this is how I work in really tight spaces. So not something that is essential to your project, but definitely can help if you are working with a canvas. So here are my embellished half circles. You can see the variety of things that I did with beads, alternating bead colors. I added sequins. Just changing up the thread color does a lot. You really can just have fun playing with the combination of sequins and beads and thread with a very simple straight stitch. So now we are going to continue with our embellishing, and I am using my button jar. I'm a button nerd. I love collecting them. I've loved them since I was little. I've pulled out a few buttons that I chose in just different colors. So you can either stitch them on one at a time, or you can use the handy dandy glue paste, which really helps with holding them in place as you stitch them. For a project like this where you are working with a heavier wood frame, anything to make your job a little bit easier will be helpful. And so I sometimes like to just glue these in place before I even stitch them. So first I'm going to just determine where I want them to go. And these are, again, these are whimsical houses. You can tell that I'm just having fun with color and shape and adding some of my favorite embellishments. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just placing them where I think they would look good and going with that. So once you have everything in place, you can either stitch them on one at a time, or you can just do what I'm doing, a little bit of glue, set it there, let it dry, and then add your stitches. These are going to be straight stitches, just like you would sew a button on. And you only really need to go through the button, depending on how heavy it is, just one time. If it's a really heavy button, go through it 2 times, just to add a little extra security. So here are my buttons. You can see I even went back and got more buttons because can you ever have enough? And I stitched all of those on. Now we are going to focus on these 2 circles inside of the house. And that's what we're going to need our larger beads for. So you don't need many, just a few, because we only have a few spots we're going to be filling in. So I think I wasn't sure which color I was going to use. I'm just placing it right now inside of the center to just see what color I like. I actually think I like one of each color. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to get my other size 6 beads. And I'm just going to pick 2 of the colors. And I think we're going to go with a pink and a red. Okay, so now you have your needle threaded. I have my needle threaded. I am bringing my needle up through the center of this bead and the larger bead. And now I'm going to take the smaller bead on my needle and I'm going to hold on to that as I take my needle back down through both beads and the fabric. This top bead is now going to anchor that in place. And I have a fully beaded bead. Say that 3 times fast. So now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just gauging, there's the middle of that one. Put the bead on. Grab the smaller bead. Hold on to that as you take your needle and thread back down through the larger bead. And then that is your anchor. So the final step is adding some feather stitch, which you can see along this house. We're just picking a few of the houses to add a little bit of embroidery to. So I'm going to use my size 5 pearl cotton. What I like about the feather stitch, I like it because it is a wandery sort of stitch. So you can see that I was able to go along a curve here and kind of break it up and do little bits of the feather stitch. And again, you don't have to do this on every piece of your project, but there are a few areas that I want to just add in some stitching. So I'm bringing my needle up. Now, as I do this, I'm going to be talking about the middle line and 2 side lines. So those are imaginary lines. Wherever I bring my needle up is the middle, or if you can picture this as a sort of vining stitch, it's going to be the middle line of the vine. So I'm bringing it up in the center or the middle. I'm holding on to that thread as I take my needle down to the side, just a little bit lower than where I originally came out. And I'm still holding on to that thread because now I need to anchor it by coming back up in the middle, which is right under that very first stitch, and pull all the way through. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going down on the side, not pulling my thread all the way through. My thumb catches it, and then I'm bringing my needle up in the center of that to anchor it. Now, if I want it to vine a little bit, rather than go back down over here, I'm going to bring it down a little bit further over here. And as long as I am anchoring my stitch every time, so because I'm going down, I'm not pulling it all the way through, I need to anchor it by coming up in the center. And now I can go back down this way. Go down, don't pull it all the way through. Bring your needle up and we're going to anchor it. So you can see that it is uneven, which lets you make this a wandery sort of stitch. I can make another one over here and then start working my way back again. This is a really small area to be showing how wandery this stitch can be, but it's a good example of how it can fill in a space and work around little curves, which is the fun thing about this stitch. I think I can end it right about there. I'm just going to take my needle down and I'm anchoring that final stitch. Just like that. So I'm going to keep doing my feather stitch and then we are almost done this. So here is my feather stitch all stitched up. I think it's a nice touch for the houses. And now we are almost done. Now this final part is optional. I added beads along the edge here. I just like the movement of it. It reminds me of like either little gardens or little sidewalks between the houses. And so I am going to make up my own little mix of beads for this using the same exact colors that I have been using all along, just so that it feels nice and cohesive. There's the word of the day. That's how you want your project to feel at the very end, nice and cohesive. So I'm going to add my 3 colors. I'm almost out of that green. You can tell it's one of my favorite greens. And just mix it up a little bit. I'm using a 12 weight cotton, just a regular beading thread. And I'm going to start just like I do with a knot in the end of the thread. So now I am bringing my needle up. The first and the last one on the canvas are the hardest because of where it is positioned, but that wasn't too bad. So now I'm going to just put a bunch of beads on my needle. I'm not doing them in any particular order. I just want a large number of beads. And you can gauge this. Once I get a few more on here, I'll show you how I gauge my length of beads that I have. I think I'm going to need a few more. These colors are so pretty together. They look like a garden of flowers, don't they? I love them. So I want to have my threads connecting from house to house. So I want to be able to come over to this house where it is, where you see the wooden beads. I want a few more though, because I want it a tiny bit drapier. So just a few more beads. And you can decide how drapey you want it. depending on where you take down your needle, that's how this is going to line up. So if I want mine to start right about here or to end right about here, I'm just taking my needle down, and I'm not going to pull super tight. If I pull it super tight, it changes how it looks, and I want it to have this appearance. I want it to have movement and be drapey. I want it to feel like a loose half circle. So now I'm going to do another one. I'm going to come back here because these are all kind of interconnected. So now I'm making the next connecting strand. This does use up a fair amount of beads, but the effect is really cool. So now again, I'm having these overlap. I can decide if I want to overlap them a little closer, if I want them to be more spread out. I'm actually going to add a few more beads. Because I don't want all of the strands to be even. So I'm going to just continue with this until I get to the very end, and then we will check out the final reveal. It's time, the full reveal. Here we go. Here is our beautiful border of either garden flowers, which I like to think it's garden flowers, or little sidewalks connecting the houses. I love the flowiness of this. It feels like it's a ruffled piece. Here is the feather stitch that I added little shaped beads to the top, adding them exactly the same way that you would add one of the SuperDuo beads. We have the SuperDuo roofs, the sequins, lots of buttons, lots of beads, so much beautiful color going on. A real whimsical row of houses. I hope that you had fun watching this and will create your own. And if you do, please tag me because I would love to see your embellished houses. Happy stitching!